In Magic the Gathering, most of the time to cast a creature, all you need to do is pay its mana cost and it goes on the stack. However, this isn't true of all creatures, some of which require additional costs in order to be cast. These requirements want you to clear some extra hurdle in order to get the creature on the battlefield, and as such, most creatures who require additional costs are super powerful to make up for the extra trouble they put you through. While there are some additional costs that you may pay in order to give a card additional upside, like how Rottenmouth Viper allows you to sacrifice non-land permanents when you cast it to reduce its cost by 1 generic for each one you sacrifice, I ultimately decided I only wanted the cards on this list to be additional costs that are required. In all, there were 43 cards eligible, and in this video we'll look at the 10 required additional cost creatures that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours. And a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Demon of Catastrophes. For 2 generic and 2 black, it's a 6/6 with flying and trample, and it requires you to sacrifice a creature as an additional cost. Obviously, this is a very impressive creature for 4 mana, one that can end the game in a few swings, and that's great, because it's also incredibly challenging to block entirely thanks to its 2 keywords. While sacrificing is legitimately an additional cost, and it means you can't cast this on an empty board, for example, Black does often have enough nice sacrifice fodder to make a card like the Demon work fairly well. Its top 8s all came in standard in decks with plenty of the aforementioned fodder, like Gutter Bones, who it was easy to bring back. In other words, those decks could really mitigate against the Demon's downside, and when you can do that, it becomes a pretty scary creature. However, Demon of Catastrophes doesn't have any top 8 since 2019, and it may lose its spot on this list in the future. At number 9, it's Stitched Drake. For 1 generic and 2 blue mana, it's a 3/4 with flying, and as an additional cost to cast it, you have to exile a creature card from your graveyard. So as long as you can get a creature into your graveyard, you can get access to this very efficient flyer. That's not the most challenging additional cost ever, but it is still an extra requirement you have to fulfill, where this Drake is stuck in your hand. While in Standard, it was played in creature-heavy Illusion aggro decks, which didn't usually have much of a problem having a creature in their graveyard by turn 3. It's also been played in Pauper mono-blue tempo decks, but it doesn't have any top 8 since 2019, so its spot on this list is definitely in danger. At number 8, it's Cobbled Lancer, which is 1 blue mana for a very impressive 3/3, and it has the same additional cost as Stitched Drake. You have to exile a creature card from your graveyard. Anyway, in addition to being a 1 mana 3/3, the Lancer also does stuff in the graveyard, because you can pay 3 generic and a blue and exile it to draw a card. In other words, the Lancer is both a nice payoff for having a stocked graveyard, and a way to take advantage of that fact. While it has the same total score as Stitched Drake, it has more first tier top 8, so it got the higher spot on the list, and all of its points came at the 2022 World Championship, where it was played in the Explorer format, which is effectively Magic Arena's version of Pioneer. There, it was featured in mono-blue aggro decks, but it doesn't have a single top 8 since then. At number 7, it's Goldmeadow Stalwart. It's 1 white mana for a 2/2, but you have to pay 1 of 2 additional costs. You can either pay 3 generic, or reveal a Kithkin from your hand. Obviously enough, going the Kithkin route is the better one, and it allows you to run this thing out on turn 1 when it's at its very best, because paying 4 mana for a 2/2 is actually completely horrendous. As such, it probably doesn't come as a surprise that Goldmeadow Stalwart was played in Kithkin decks in both block and standard, which could obviously get even more value out of the Stalwart because it was a Kithkin, so stuff like Wizened Sen could buff it, and it could be tapped to give Cloud Goat Ranger +2/+0 and flying until end of turn. However, Kithkin decks haven't really been viable in any format since 2009. We are returning to Lorwyn early next year, and it's not entirely impossible that we get some good Kithkin stuff in the set, or even a reprint of this card, in which case it has a pretty good chance of putting up more top 8s in the future. At number 6, it's Skaab Ruinator, another big blue Innistrad zombie with an additional cost that requires you to exile creatures from the graveyard, in this case, 3 of them. But you get to pay 1 generic and 2 blue for a massive 5/6 flyer that itself can also be cast from the graveyard. This means if you're great at loading the graveyard, milling this, and a bunch of other creatures gives you access to it without ever having to draw it. While in Standard, it saw play in Birthing Pod decks. This deck specialized in using the pod to sacrifice creatures for value and moving up a chain to more and more powerful creatures as you did so, while also reaping the benefits of enters and death triggers. The Ruinator worked nicely in the deck because your graveyard was usually filled with creatures you had sacrificed, so casting it was easy, whether you're doing it from your hand or from the graveyard after it's already been sacrificed to the pod, and it can be sacrificed multiple times to the pod, which is pretty great. It's also seen occasional play in Modern, including in Merfolk decks. Obviously the Ruinator isn't a Merfolk, but these decks do have a lot of creatures, and they use Aether Vial, which can help you get around the Ruinator's additional cost and just put it into play directly. It also sees occasional play in Modern Dredge, especially after Stitcher's Supplier got printed. This one creature can load the graveyard incredibly quickly, making the Ruinator more viable. However, it never caught on in a big way in Modern Merfolk or Dredge, and it doesn't have any top 8 since 2020. At number 5, it's Souls of the Lost. For 1 generic and a black, it's a creature with power equal to the number of permanent cards in your graveyard, and its toughness is equal to that number plus 1. But as an additional cost to cast it, you have to sacrifice a permanent or discard a card. In this case, the additional cost does provide some upside, since it can make the souls bigger, but it does also make it a little bit harder to find a window where you want to cast it. Obviously enough, Souls of the Lost really thrives in graveyard decks, and it's being played in Standard right now, as there are lots of amazing ways to load the graveyard in the format, like Overlord of the Baelmerk and Town Greeter. It also sees some play in Pioneer and Modern graveyard decks, which have access to the aforementioned Stitcher's Supplier and many other sweet cards to get permanents into the graveyard. In addition to just working nicely with itself, the souls can also help set up your other graveyard nonsense, like by discarding Parhelion 2 to bring it back with Greasefang in Pioneer, or by discarding Archon of Cruelty in Modern to bring it back with Emperor of Bones. Souls of the Lost is in a great spot in multiple formats right now and is likely to continue to put up top 8s, and it's got a great shot at moving higher on the list in the future. At number 4, it's Wren's Run Vanquisher. It's part of the same Lorwyn cycle as Goldmeadow Stalwart, meaning it's an above-rate creature that has an additional cost that requires you to reveal a creature of a particular type from your hand or pay an additional mana cost. In this case, you can reveal an elf or pay 3 generic, and it's 1 generic and a green for a 3/3 with Death Touch. A creature like the Vanquisher is formidable on turn 2, and thanks to Death Touch, it's pretty much always relevant. Unsurprisingly, the Vanquisher has been played in elf decks in block, standard, and extended, but it doesn't have any top 8 since 2011, and Souls of the Lost is almost certainly going to pass it in the near future. At number 3, it's Fear of Isolation. For 1 generic and a blue, it's a 2/3 enchantment creature with flying. As an additional cost to cast it, you have to return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. While it does take some setup, after all, if you don't have any other permanents, then you have to return a land to your hand when you cast this. But there are also lots of ways to generate sweet value with this additional cost, and that's amazing, since you're also getting an above-rate creature. In Standard, it's played alongside Nurturing Pixie in Esper decks as one of the main cards that enables you to get sweet value by bouncing things to your hand. Hopeless Nightmare and Nowhere to Run are particularly nasty, as each of them is an enchantment with an enters trigger that gives you at least a card worth of value, and if you're picking up your removal or discard spell with Fear of Isolation, it definitely feels like the additional cost here is just really, really good. Ultimately, Hopeless Nightmare and another enabler for the deck that also had some combo potential, This Town Ain't Big Enough, got banned in Standard in June of this year, but Fear of Isolation hasn't stopped seeing play entirely. It and the Pixie are still teaming up in Standard, where they are great for helping you trigger Cosmogrand Zenith's powerful double spell trigger, and Cryogen Relic has proven to be a really great card to bounce with the Fear and Pixie, since it draws when it enters and leaves the battlefield. The Fear is also played in Pioneer, where it shows up in Dimir control decks that can still go crazy with Hopeless Nightmare among other things, like the Kamigawa Channel lands, which are sweet to bounce to your hand when you want the spell-like effect. Fear of Isolation is going to continue to put up top 8s in both Standard and Pioneer. I just told you about Fear of Isolation, so let me tell you about one of my biggest fears, not hitting 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year. I'm getting close to my goal, and if you want to keep me from being scared, hit the subscribe button and help me get there. At number 2, it's Abhorrent Oculus. Like Fear of Isolation, this is a Duskmourn card with an additional cost that is already doing really, really well. For 2 generic and a blue, it's an impressive 5/5 flyer that also manifests dread at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep. This means you look at your top 2 cards and put one into play face down as a 2/2 and put the other in the graveyard. The face down card can be turned face up at any time for its mana cost if it's a creature. In other words, this spits out a 2/2 with significant upside during your opponent's turn every time, so of course this powerhouse needs to have some kind of additional cost, and it does. You have to exile 6 cards from your graveyard. So yeah, this is like Stitch Drake or Skaab Ruinator on steroids. It's way scarier than either of them, and it helps you with other graveyard synergies thanks to Manifest Dread. So it does largely have a heftier requirement to cast it, but it turns out it's well worth the effort in every single one of Magic's formats. That's right, this is already played everywhere, including in Legacy and Vintage. There are plenty of ways to load the graveyard quickly, even in Standard, so the Oculus is even seeing play there. One nasty thing decks in Standard do to get around Abhorrent Oculus's additional cost is reanimate it on the cheap with something like Helping Hand. There are Pioneer decks that can definitely get 6 cards in the graveyard for it too, but they're also pretty happy to use Neoform on a 2-drop like Philology Archaeologist to tutor up the Oculus and put it directly on the battlefield without having to worry about any additional cost. While it's been successful everywhere, so far Modern is the format where it's been the most successful. It appears there in Reanimator decks with a similar structure to the other decks we've discussed. That is, the deck can definitely fill the graveyard quickly and cast it, but these decks also have Unearth to bring back the Oculus for 1 mana. It also sometimes sees play alongside Murktide Regent, who actively likes it when the Oculus gobbles up instants and sorceries. Basically, Abhorrent Oculus has become one of the best win conditions for control decks in the entire Modern format. It sees play in even more potent Reanimator decks in Legacy and Vintage, which have access to absurd cards like Entomb and Reanimate. Abhorrent Oculus is currently seeing play in every format it's legal in, and that's a recipe for a card to put up an insane score. I mean, it already has one and hasn't even been around for a full year, so it will quite easily be the number 1 card in this list in the future. For now though, that number 1 card is Silvergill Adept, the 3rd card from Lorwyn's additional cost reveal cycle to make the list. For 1 generic and a blue, it's a 2/1 that draws you a card when it enters, so it's not overstated the way the Goldmeadow Stalwart and Wren's Run Vanquisher are. However, it does give you a 2-for-1, so the fact it's a 2/1 that does that is even more impressive than anything those cards can do. In this case, the additional cost is revealing a merfolk from your hand or paying 3 generic mana. It might not be quite as flashy as the Oculus, but like it, the Adept has put up top 8s in every format it's ever been legal in, albeit never at the same absurd rate as the Oculus. That's because the Oculus fits into basically any graveyard deck in any format, while the Adept has to be more specifically played in Merfolk decks. And while Merfolk decks have been relevant everywhere at one time or another, that still limits it to one super specific kind of deck. And indeed, it's been one of the best Merfolk in the game ever since being printed in 2007. It even got a reprint in Rivals of Ixalan, giving it legality in Standard again and making it legal in Pioneer too, although neither of those formats has really had the critical mass of Merfolk and payoffs for them that is necessary to make this card great. But that critical mass definitely exists in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, where a plethora of lords makes it easy for Merfolk decks to overwhelm their opponents in a hurry. The Adept gives you a nice body that can also help you find more of your lords. Silvergill Adept is still seeing play, but as I've already indicated, Abhorrent Oculus is going to pass it in the very, very near future. So, those are Magic's best creatures that require you to pay additional costs. If you like having to jump through extra hoops to play your creatures, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, and there are over 900 of them, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.